Yes, welcome back to the apologist, and welcome back to our study on the revelation of hell. And in this particular section of the series, we're studying heaven. And our topic for this section of the series is heaven, a revelation of heaven relative to the Platonic doctrine of hell. Heaven in relationship to hell. And in our study, my main focus is to show that the glories of heaven that the Lord has revealed to us in the scriptures show us that heaven is when God is dwelling with man eternally, and God fills all in all, and that there is no space in heaven. Heaven is eternity. Heaven is what comes at the end of this world. Heaven is when God fills all in all, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, down from verse number 24 down, as the Apostle Paul talks about when after Jesus Christ has delivered up the kingdom, then God will be all in all. That is heaven there. And the same thing is discussed in 2 Peter chapter 3, going down to verse number 13, when he says we look forward to a new heavens and a new earth. And the same thing is discussed in Revelation chapter 21, where the Apostle John received the revelation from the Lord and said, I saw new heavens, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And so what we're trying to show is that the heaven that we're going to is a heaven that is absolutely filled with the light and the glory of God, and that nothing that is defiled will enter into it. There's nothing that is defiled, nothing from the curse. And when we say nothing, we mean absolutely nothing. And I believe the teachers and pushers of the hell doctrine are teaching that that there is something that will enter there, and that is the Platonic ideal of hell, men burning in fire in the afterlife. This idea was preached by Plato about 227 years before Christ, and Plato died before Christ came on the scene. So the ideal of men burning in fires in the afterlife came from a pagan perspective. Plato received it from the pagan world, which the Greeks and the Medes and the Babylonians, the Greeks, and all of those foreign nations had that in the background of their philosophy and their religion. And all of those are nations that were not a part of the children of God, who were the Israelites in the Old Testament, who had actually been revealed, who was revealed to them who the true God was. Abraham, it was revealed to him who the true God was. And Abraham left the Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham was raised a pagan. He was raised a pagan. And they believed in paganism. And so Abraham left the Ur of the Chaldean, where his father was a pagan. And when he left there, he left the pagans that were originated from what we call the Tower of Babel. And the paganism that originated from the Tower of Babel, that line of paganism that came down through the generations and through the nations that did not know God, they were the people who came up with the ideal of burning in fires in the afterlife. And they taught that and passed that around in the paganistic communities and in paganism and religion. But if you notice, those that were revealed the true God of Israel through Abraham, they did not hold that doctrine. And so Abraham, at the Tower of Babel, they were scattered at the Tower of Babel in the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis. That was the inauguration of the world of paganism. And the doctrine of burning in fires and gods of fires came from the branch of those nations and religions that came out from the Tower of Babel, which were later named Babylon, the great, the whore, the polluters of the world. The doctrine of hell came through that line that is described in Revelation chapter 17. Babylon the Great is falling. It is the religious system. So the doctrine of hell came through that line, not through the line of Abraham, which brought the children of Israel and who were introduced the true God, the one and only true God. No one who was introduced the one and only true God had the doctrine of burning in fire in the afterlife. The children of Israel didn't have that in the Old Testament. No, the children of Israel, Moses, Elijah, none of the prophets who were from the seed of Abraham had that doctrine. That doctrine came from those unsaved heathens. So it was passed around in the pagan world until it got to the Greeks. And so Plato, being a Greek philosopher, was given much credit for things just falling in his head. But he actually inherited the ideal of burning in fires in the afterlife from the pagan world, as they had passed it down from generation to generation when they had that spirit of rebellion against God at the Tower of Babel, and God scattered them across the world. And they're the ones that came up with this. This is not Jewish. This is not from the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and it's not apostolic. Jesus didn't teach it. There's a lot of scriptures that have been twisted to make it appear that Jesus was teaching this, but Jesus never said the word hell out of his mouth. That word didn't even get into writings until about the 1400s. And so it's not an original Bible word, and it's not a word from the people of God. And so Plato had that idea of men burning in fires in the afterlife. And so the whole world, before Jesus came, the whole world, with the exception of the Jews, mostly in the West, were Platonic. In other words, they believed in Plato and fires in the afterlife. Therefore, when they finally got Jesus, and Plato was long gone, he was dead. When they finally got the gospel, they tried to fix the gospel to talk about the burning fires in the afterlife. So all of the things that were in the gospel, they tried to rig them to say that these are saying that there's burning in fires in the afterlife. But one of the reasons why I brought up Plato is to let you know that the idea of there being burning fires in the afterlife and fires in heaven and hell in heaven and all that is not found in the Bible. That came from Platonic thinking and the pagan world. But as we read the scriptures today, we're going to show you that that was not taught by the Bible about heaven. All right? And so our topic is a revelation of heaven relative to the doctrine of hell. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that the teaching that on the end or in eternity, there's going to be a lake of people firing and burning in fire, and God angry and burning them and not letting them get out, and them burning in fire forever with no end, and the condemnation and the damning of man for eternity is not biblical. It's not biblical, it's not the gospel, and it's not apostolic. Now, so we're going to go to Revelation chapter 21. We discussed Revelation 20 and 21 in our last lesson. And we pointed out that at the end of the world, Revelation 20 is talking about the end of the world. And the lake that burns with fire and brimstone is a lake that is for the annihilation of all things in the fall, especially death, which is the major enemy of God. And death and all the things of the fall are done away with in Revelation 20. In Revelation 20, when it talks about, it says here in verse number 13, it said, and verse number 14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the annihilation of all of the things of the fall, getting rid of them in preparation for the new heaven and the new earth, which is the heaven that we preach about. And so here we see, and whosoever's name was not written in the Lamb, and was not written in the book of life, was cast into the lake of fire. All right? So now, the lake of fire, watch this here. The lake of fire is the second death. Why is that? Because here, in verse number 14, what happens is that death is gotten rid of. And so the end of death is the second death, when death and hell are cast into the lake. Death here has to do with death, and hell has to do with the grave and the hold of death. It will be no more when the curse is taken out. The ridding of death is the second death. The second death is the ridding of death itself. Some people say the second death is people going to hell. That's not what this is saying. This is saying that death, which is the major enemy of God in the universe, and the hell, death and hell, when Jesus says that he has the keys to death and hell, he's talking about he has the keys to the death, which is the major enemy of God, which is everything else is subject to that. The death and the hold of death. As Peter said in Acts chapter 2:22, that Jesus rose from the dead because he could not be held of death. So death and hell, you'll see them together, even in the death and the burial, which is the hold of the dead. The death, the burial, when Jesus resurrected from the grave, that was a victory over the hold of death. Here, this is a corporate victory over the hold of death of all men from the sea or wherever they're buried. They come up out, and then death and hell are cast into the lake. The lake that burns with fire and brimstone is the annihilation of all things that are from the fall that offended men. And all of these things must go according to Revelation chapter 20. In order that in Revelation 21 we can see heaven come in. And so the second death here is actually the death of death. The second death is the death of death. It is not people burning in fire. It is what God is doing here in Revelation chapter 20, verse 12 down through 15, is showing you that all men who died, no matter where, they're going to be loosed from death. Death is, and the hold of death. This is dealing with death and the hold of death. And so there'll be no one, according to verse 15, who will be in heaven who will not have life. So the whole system of death is done away with. And there'll be no one who will be in glory who will not have life. So the scene switches at the end of chapter 20 Revelation, and it comes into the beginning of Revelation chapter 21. This is the scene of heaven. But let me go back first before I go to heaven on Revelation 21. You go back to Revelation 20 verse number 11. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. The earth and the heaven. This is at the end. This is the transition from Adam's world to heaven. The earth and the heaven fled away. It'll go away. All that is in it will go away. There will be no more of Adam's world. And so in the fleeing of the earth and the heaven, it goes away. And so that there's nothing in it that we go over into the eternal state. And that's the point we're trying to make. That's the point that the Revelation is saying, that no part of it will be in the eternal state. Revelation chapter 21, verse number 1, and I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Now, here we see here that the revelation of the first heaven and the first earth